Thanks very much. I'll attempt to be as brisk and to the point as possible. And let me start by acknowledging the great work that Joe does and to thank him for his invitation to speak here again this year. I've been getting in trouble since I was a lot younger than I am now for impudently correcting teachers. So let me continue with that happy habit by pointing out to Noel Dempsey that, as Lucinda says, it was actually Harry Truman and not Teddy Roosevelt who had a sign which said the buck stops here at his desk. And it's a little known fact that Bertie Ahern had a sign on his desk which said the buck stops here as well, but he meant something slightly different by it. And some bucks did stop there. You know the rest of that one. To the topic, and even by the which is on, I think, page 8 of your brochure, and even by the somewhat esoteric standards of MacGill debates, the title of this one is a little convoluted and somewhat ambiguously phrased, I thought. At the core of decades of inadequate governance and crises is our political process. Question mark. Question mark. I'm not sure about the question mark. I wondered if it was a mark of humility, perhaps, by Joe Mulholland and the shadowy international forces behind MacGill. Was it maybe a sign or an acknowledgement that perhaps he didn't have all the answers? And I know this is a heretical thought, but that the solutions to our political shortcomings might not actually be found in the cocktail of windy debates and late night pints and early morning swims that makes MacGill, but obviously that couldn't be true. But there is something grammatically or syntactically peculiar about the construction of the question. And I wondered, actually, is there a word missing at the end of the question? At the core of inadequate governance and crisis in our political process is what? Is it responsible? Is it responsible for everything? Is it downright silly? You can tweet your own suggestions. Anyway, this is a somewhat tortured way of saying that today's proposition seems to me to be open to some interpretation, and you'll forgive me if I exercise some leeway on that. Because what I want to argue is that the central failure of politics and governance in our country has been a failure to articulate what the public interest is, how to defend it, and how we should promote it. I think we've allowed a politics to evolve in which the public interest, or the national interest, if you like, as Noel referred to it, ranks far down the list of the priorities of politicians and policymakers, far behind expediency, electoral advantage, short-term popularity, and the wishes of vocal special interest groups. And when the national interest comes last, good government goes out the window. So I want to look briefly at the inadequacy or otherwise of our governance, and I look at the recent inadequacy of our government in the period before the crash and its response to it momentarily. But I think it might be only fair if we mention a few things right now that often get lost in the shout-fest of much political debate and in the midst of our well-established tendency to think of ourselves as somehow uniquely disadvantaged. I offer these facts without comment, except to say that they contradict, I think, the suggestions that we live in a banana republic, or that our republic is a failed state, or that our politicians are uniquely crooked, useless, mad, or bad. I don't believe this to be the case. I think we live in a country whose politics does not serve us as well as it could and as well as it should. I think we have only a limited perception of this and why that is. and we are consequently squandering an opportunity to change it. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but now some facts about the adequacy or otherwise of our governance. We live in one of the wealthiest countries in the world, wealthier now than it was at the start of the boom, and a country that is getting wealthier. How that wealth is distributed, augmented, taxed. Of course, these are properly matters for political debate, but the existence of the wealth is a fact, and by and large, it's better to live in a wealthy country than in a poor one. We have a largely modern infrastructure. Yes, we need better broadband in most of Ireland, and particularly in parts of rural Ireland. Yes, having driven down yesterday, there should be a motorway to Sligo and to the northwest. There should also be one between Cork and Limerick. But there's been a massive modernisation of our physical infrastructure in this country in the last 2.5 decades, partly with help from the EU, but also from our own resources. Now, you can argue, with some cases I've done here before, that we've hugely overpaid for it. Our system of public administration seems often to be incapable of getting good value for money, but that's a slightly different point. Our educational standards are not world-beating, but they're decent. More people than ever are educated to higher standards. The health of Ireland is in most respects good, and it is improving. Our health service is dysfunctional in some respects and chronically inefficient in others. There are some dreadful black spots, including many emergency departments. But life expectancy has risen impressively in recent decades, and Irish people are living longer, healthier lives than they ever did. Overall, our standards of living have improved pretty significantly here in the last 2 decades. And if our political system and our politicians get a lot of blame for the failures of the state, they are entitled to some of the credit for its successes. And this is the thing I think that we need to really examine for ourselves. Many of these things, many of these benefits, many of these improvements we have achieved despite our political system and not because of it. Because in many ways that you'll all be familiar with, our politics has failed spectacularly too, and its most technicolor failure is the recent one, with which we are all too familiar. So there are two main aspects, I think, of the economic disaster of the 2008-2010 period. First was the collapse of the banking system, which previous speakers have averred to, kept alive only by the transfer of tens of billions of euros from public funds to keep it alive. This was the result of suicidal failure by the banks, which the state failed to oversee or to regulate. Intrusive, thorough regulation was not in the bank's interests or in the interests of the bankers who ratcheted up their loan books to earn bonuses for themselves, but it was in the public interest. And this failure to identify, describe and defend the public interest in the general, and in this case in the particular, is perhaps the key failure, I think, of our system of governments. Ireland is not unique, certainly, in its failure to adequately regulate its banks. But the failure of our banks was uniquely destructive. And this was because of the second aspect of the economic disaster, which the failure of the banks prompted. The sudden implosion of the public finances, which resulted in the extreme austerity implemented by 2 governments to restore the stability in the public finances necessary for economic confidence and therefore economic growth. And why were our public finances so brittle just before the crash? Because, to simplify greatly, taxes had been cut and spending had been increased over several years. This was done by the parties in power, and it is to them that the primary responsibility accrues. But it was criticised. Those governments were criticised by those not in power for not being sufficiently generous. So why is this? Why did our political system run this huge auction, the auction that Noel Whelan mentioned this morning that he fears we are sleepwalking back into? Because nobody was concerned with the public interest. Rather, they were concerned in meeting what the public said it was interested in: lower taxes, higher spending, investment for our constituency, grants for our project, pay increases for me, and to hell with the national interest. Let somebody else look after that. Now, we should be realistic. One does not expect politicians to retail misery. The offering of blood, sweat and tears is not one that voters have generally found appealing. But it is surely in our own longer-term interest to recognise that pretend politics and fantasy economics are not a recipe for reaching the sunlit uplands. In the past, the fundamental failing of our politics is that it has reflected principally the special and the sectional interest. There has been no constituency out there for the public interest. No hearing or reward for any politician prepared to say to voters, we must discipline ourselves. We must provide for the future. We must tax sustainably and invest wisely. We must say no to some interest groups. There wasn't a big constituency for that. And if this is to change, it requires a change in mindset for the voting public as much as it does for the political classes elected by them. Despite my callow youth, I've had the honour of addressing this gathering on a number of occasions. And I mean that, it is an honour. I do. Invariably, the topics on which I've spoken have been related to the one which we now discussed. It's not only the jokes that I've been repeating year after year. But I've also asked the same question every time I've been here. If we had, or if Bertie Ahern had, foreseen the economic crash and warned us in 2006 that it was coming, what would we have done? If he had gone before the electorate in 2007 with a manifesto that promised to restrict bank lending, introduce a property tax, and increase income tax to create a financial buffer for the state, what would we have done? Would he have been fired as leader of Fianna Fáil before or after the general election defeat that would surely have resulted? But let me leave that old question aside and let me ask a new one. What will we do in the forthcoming election? What will we do if a politician says that we need to maintain fiscal discipline, cancel tax cuts and welfare increases, close the budget deficit and pay down our loans? What will we do? Of course, there are other models of prudent and sensible government. Perhaps they involve a wealth tax, or higher taxes on those who are better off, or more taxes on the relatively lightly taxed low and mid-income earners in this country. But whatever model you follow, whatever balance you strike, we should beware of politicians that we can have whatever we want, with no sacrifice from anyone and no inconvenience for any group. There is some encouraging signs of more realistic debates in our politics. There is some indication that a recognition of policy trade-offs between tax and spending is emerging, but not enough of it. And as the shock of the crash recedes, so the shock our politics experienced recedes too. Before it disappears completely, we should ask ourselves, is there a constituency out there for good government? How do we create it? Is there a constituency out there for long-term planning, for necessary reform even when it is opposed by entrenched and powerful interest groups? Is there a constituency for prudence, for self-discipline, for political honesty about the trade-offs between tax and spending? Or is there a greater appetite than ever for the old politics of sectional advantage, of promising all things to all men, of ignoring the inconvenient fact of the world that our actions have consequences and that unwise actions have unpleasant consequences? Is there a bigger constituency than ever for ignoring the fact that if the boom's getting boomier, then the gloom might get gloomier yet? Sometimes, for all the changes we've seen in our political landscape, I wonder if we have changed at a more profound level. The cataclysm of the recession and the reform mandated by the Troika during the national trauma of the bailout has seen swingeing cuts and eye-watering tax hikes, to be sure. But the old system is hard at work restoring those. We have left some powerful invested interests in charge of their own fiefdoms. The legal profession has largely rebutted efforts to reform its structures. The power of consultants still dominates the health system. Our civil and public service has emerged largely intact and is now about the business of restoring its own pay. A prominent medium-term objective of economic policy appears to be just this: restoration of pay, social welfare, tax and spending. We are demanding, and the government is responding to our demands, a return to a situation that I thought everybody had agreed was unsustainable. Go figure. So in many respects, the way in which we do politics has not changed. There is an undeniable appetite for change among many voters, but its electoral expression is likely to be dissipated among several groups rather than coming together to achieve critical mass. Parties and candidates who say they are committed to change have not come together to form a force which would make that change likely after the next election. They have expressed much energy, but they have not been successful in the difficult but essential political tasks of compromising, deal-making and coalition building among themselves. The failure of an alternative force to come together may well end up leaving the old politics in charge. Perhaps that's what we really want. As the late Peter Mayer said from this podium, we get the politics we deserve. If that is happening, and I don't know if it is, but if it is happening, it's not just a missed opportunity. It's a sure way of repeating the mistakes of the past. Thank you.